You ever notice how certain things just stay with you, even decades later? Like, you can't throw something away without feeling guilty. You can't ask for help without feeling weak. You can't show emotion without hearing a voice in your head telling you to toughen up. I watched my father live this his entire life. He couldn't say, "I love you," without it sounding like an apology. He couldn't rest without feeling like he was being lazy. Not because he didn't care, but because caring openly, resting openly, wasn't what boys who grew up in the 60s were taught to do. Research on authoritarian parenting from that era shows that children raised in emotionally restrictive environments develop higher emotional suppression in adulthood, not because they lack emotion, but because they were never allowed to express it. If this already sounds uncomfortably familiar, you are definitely not alone. Not every family was like this, but if you grew up in a more traditional, strict household in the 60s, a lot of this will feel familiar. Your kids might think you're emotionally distant, reserved, hard to read. They see someone who doesn't talk about feelings, someone who solves problems alone, someone who seems uncomfortable with affection. But inside your mind, something very different is going on. You're not cold. You were raised in a world that punished warmth. And there's actual psychology behind why the rules you learned as a child in the 1960s still dictate how you move through the world today. Why asking for help feels like failure. Why showing vulnerability feels dangerous. Why you still hear those old voices telling you to be tougher, work harder, need less. If you've ever felt guilty for needing support, for struggling to express emotion, for believing that showing weakness is the worst thing you could do, this is for you. Because the way your mind learned to survive wasn't your choice. It was the only option you were given, and understanding why changes everything. So, let's talk about what really happens when a child grows up in an era that valued stoicism over sensitivity, obedience over expression, and silence over truth. Here's the thing most people don't understand. You didn't choose to be emotionally reserved. You were trained to be. You learned. Probably before you could even articulate it, that showing emotion was dangerous. And your nervous system just held on to that lesson. You grew up with rotary phones, strict bedtimes, and a house where nobody said mental health out loud, where fathers came home from work, sat in their chairs, and didn't speak about their day, where mothers kept the house running no matter what was happening inside them. Maybe it was a father who told you to stop crying or "I'll give you something to cry about." Maybe it was a mother who smiled through her own pain and expected you to do the same. The 1960s raised children on the belief that feelings were inconvenient, that sadness was self-pity, that fear was cowardice, that anything other than control and composure was failure. You heard, children should be seen and not heard. You heard, big boys don't cry. You heard, stop being so sensitive. And if something was wrong at home, what happens in this house stays in this house. So you learned to push it down, to keep it in, to never let anyone see you struggle, because struggling meant you weren't strong enough. Here's what's happening under the hood. Children learn emotional regulation through modeling. They need adults to show them that feelings are safe to express, that vulnerability doesn't equal weakness, that it's okay to not be okay. But if you grew up in the 60s, you didn't get that. You got emotional suppression modeled as strength. And your brain learned emotions are a problem to be managed, not a signal to be understood. This is why, even now, you struggle to name what you're feeling. Why you say, "I'm fine," when you're not. Why you'd rather fix a problem than talk about how it makes you feel. Because talking about feelings wasn't what people did. You handled it. You moved on. You didn't burden others with your problems. You're not emotionally stunted. You were emotionally trained to survive in a world that didn't make space for what you felt. Psychological research shows that children raised in emotionally restrictive environments develop what's called alexithymia. difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. Not because they don't feel, but because they were never taught that feelings were information worth paying attention to. Sound familiar? Before we go deeper, hit like. If you were raised to believe you should be able to handle everything on your own. Here's the part that makes it worse. You weren't just taught to be self-reliant. You were taught that needing help meant you were failing. The 1960s were built on a foundation of rugged individualism. You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. You didn't complain. You didn't ask for handouts. You figured it out. And if you couldn't, that was your fault. So you learned to do everything alone, to never admit when you were struggling, to see asking for support as a sign of weakness rather than wisdom. That same father I mentioned would drive in circles for an hour rather than stop and ask for directions. Not because he was stubborn, but because asking for help felt like admitting defeat. Here's the part nobody talks about. You weren't just taught independence. You were taught that your worth was tied to how little you needed from others. That being strong meant never leaning on anyone. That self-sufficiency was the highest virtue. So, even now, when you're overwhelmed, when you're hurting, when you genuinely need support, you don't ask. You grit your teeth. You push through. You tell yourself you'll handle it, because asking for help still feels like failing, and failing was never an option. This is why you say yes when you're already stretched thin. Why you won't go to the doctor until something is seriously wrong. Why you'd rather suffer in silence than admit you can't do it all. You're not being proud. You're operating exactly as you were trained, self-contained, undemanding, strong enough to handle anything without burdening anyone else. But here's the truth. That's not strength. That's survival. And survival isn't the same as living. Let's be honest. Rest wasn't something you feared. It was being seen as lazy. You grew up in an era where your value was measured by your productivity, by how hard you worked, by how much you could endure without complaining. The 60s were the tail end of a generation that lived through the Depression and fought in World War II. Your parents knew scarcity. They knew sacrifice. And they raised you to believe that anything worth having required struggle. So, you learned that rest was indulgence. That taking time for yourself was selfish. That if you weren't working, you weren't worthy. Here's why this matters. Your sense of self wasn't built on who you were. It was built on what you could do, how much you could produce, how well you could perform, how little you needed to stop, and if you stopped, if you rested, your brain interpreted that as failure, as laziness, as proof that you weren't good enough. This is why, even now, you feel guilty sitting down, why you can't enjoy a vacation without thinking about what needs to be done at home, why retirement feels less like freedom and more like losing your purpose. Because your identity was built on being useful. And without work, you don't know who you are. Developmental psychology shows that children who internalize the belief that their worth is conditional on productivity often struggle with chronic guilt and an inability to rest, even when rest is desperately needed. This next one is going to hit home. Here's something people don't realize about growing up in the 60s. You weren't raised to think critically. You were raised to obey. Teachers were right, parents were right, authority figures were never to be questioned, you didn't talk back, you didn't challenge, and if something felt wrong, you didn't speak up. You fell in line. Because I said so wasn't just a phrase, it was the end of every conversation. So you learned that your thoughts didn't matter as much as compliance. That challenging authority was disrespectful. That the adults knew best, even when they didn't. Studies show that authoritarian parenting, common in the 1960s, is linked to lower self-advocacy in adulthood, where individuals struggle to assert their needs or challenge unfair treatment because they were taught that questioning authority equals disrespect. And here's the cruel irony. This made you incredibly disciplined. You follow rules. You respect structure. You don't cause trouble. But it also made it harder for you to stand up for yourself, to say no when something doesn't feel right, to trust your own judgment over someone else's authority. This is why you struggle to advocate for yourself at the doctor's office, why you don't push back when someone treats you unfairly, why you defer to others even when you know you're right. You're not weak. You were taught to value obedience over autonomy. And that belief doesn't just disappear because you're older now. Here's the real question nobody stops to ask. What happened to the pain you weren't allowed to express? You grew up in an era that didn't have words for trauma, that didn't acknowledge PTSD, that didn't believe children could be depressed or anxious or struggling in ways that mattered. If something bad happened to you, abuse, neglect, loss, you weren't taken to therapy, you weren't given space to process. You were told to move on, to be grateful for what you had, to stop dwelling on the past. So you buried it. You locked it away. You pretended it didn't affect you, even though it shaped everything about who you became. That same father, he came back from Vietnam and never spoke about it. Not once. Not because he was fine, but because talking about it wasn't what men did. You carried it. You didn't burden others with your pain. And here's the part that changes everything. Unprocessed pain doesn't just go away. It lives in your body, in your nervous system, in the way you react to stress, the way you relate to others, the way you move through the world. You might not call it trauma, you might call it just the way things were, but your body remembers. And it still responds as if those old threats are present, even when they're long gone. This is why you startle easily, why you have trouble sleeping, why certain situations make you shut down without knowing why, because your nervous system never got the message that the danger passed. It's still on guard, still protecting you from something that happened decades ago. Trauma research shows that individuals who experienced adverse childhood events without emotional support often carry physiological stress responses into adulthood. Higher cortisol, hypervigilance, difficulty with emotional regulation, not because they're broken, but because their nervous systems adapted to survive. The past is never dead. It's not even past. William Faulkner. Here's what you need to hear. The way you were raised wasn't your fault, and the way you still carry those lessons isn't a character flaw. You were shaped by a world that valued toughness over tenderness, that rewarded silence over honesty, that taught you to endure rather than to feel. And you survived. You built a life. You did what you were supposed to do. But survival isn't the same as healing, and the rules that kept you safe as a child don't have to govern you now. You can learn that emotions aren't weakness. They're information. That asking for help isn't failure. It's wisdom. That rest isn't laziness. It's necessary. That your worth isn't measured by how much you produce or how little you need. Not all at once, not by erasing everything you've ever known, but gradually, one small permission at a time. You get to say how you feel. You get to ask for support. You get to rest without guilt. You get to be more than what you were taught you had to be. And the people who love you, they don't need you to be strong all the time. They just need you to be real. Because you were never too much. You were just raised in a world that didn't make space for all of who you are, and now you get to make that space for yourself. Your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's doing exactly what it was trained to do in the 1960s. And those adaptations made sense then. But they don't have to define you now. So here's what psychology reveals. If you still feel the weight of how you were raised, if you still hear those old voices telling you to be tougher, need less, feel smaller, it's not because you're stuck in the past. It's because the past is still living in you. And that's not weakness. That's what happens when you grow up in a world that didn't teach you how to process what you felt. But healing doesn't have an age limit. Permission doesn't expire. You can still learn that it's okay to be human, to need, to feel, to rest. You don't have to keep carrying what you were taught to carry. You get to put some of it down. And maybe the real question isn't whether you can change after all these years. It's whether you'll finally let yourself become the person you were never allowed to be. Drop a mantelpiece clock emoji if you grew up in the 60s and you're still unlearning what that decade taught you. And comment this: I wasn't raised to talk about feelings. I'm learning that doesn't mean I don't have them.